It's Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast, a podcast to help social studies teachers and teacher educators use film effectively in their classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Roberts, and in each episode, we talk with a volume editor and lesson plan developer to determine the accuracy of their favorite films.
Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast. This is the television episode where we talk about using television shows in the Hollywood or History strategy. I'm here with my guest today, Dr. Starlynn Nance, to talk about her book, which is the 5th volume in the series. Welcome, Star.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. It's very good to see you. I am very happy that you have joined us. You were the first person to write a solo book in the Hollywood or History, you and Mark Piercy, who we talked with a few weeks ago. So whereas most of the books have an editor, and then they brought on other folks to write the lessons, you took the plunge and did everything. So you were the editor and you also wrote the lesson. So we'll talk a little bit more about that book and some of the lessons that you developed in the podcast today. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, my name is Dr. Starlynn Nance, and for the past 13 years, I was the director and supervisor and faculty advisor for the Social Studies Education Department at the University of Central Missouri. Prior to that, I was at Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts, and I was the middle school director and coordinator. And prior to that, I was a high school counselor and junior high counselor, and then social studies teacher at public and private schools.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you. We've done a lot of work together over the years. So again, I think for my Michigan listeners, you're going to hear 2 Southern accents today. So just be ready for the y'alls and fixins and the ain'ts are coming out. But yeah, well, it's great to have you again. I really did enjoy your book, and I think again with the focus on television, it just adds a wrinkle to our study of how to use film. And again, we use the word film loosely. It could be movies, documentaries, cartoons, television shows, whatever, and really using that to help students learn more about history and social studies. So let's go and get started. So I'll let you do the talking now. Again, your volume is called Hollywood History and Inquiry-Based Strategy for Using Television Shows to Teach Issued-Centered Curriculum. Can you talk a little bit more about your book, some of the television shows you looked at, and what was the impetus of you writing this volume?
Well, I had this idea a long time ago about using television shows because I just was watching Last Man Standing just for entertainment, and they talk a lot about politics. Tim Allen, that show leans conservative, but in a funny way. And I wanted to have one of my former students, he's a head principal now, but I asked him if he would teach a lesson if we put it together. However, the district he was in, they had a very rigid curriculum and we couldn't fit it in. Several years later, Hollywood or History comes along and I write, for the world history. And then it extended and I thought, here's my chance. And so you and I talked and you approved it. And I started actually listening to the episodes versus more academically versus just for entertainment. And I thought, this is great. You can show the whole episode in class. You can use snippets in class. You can listen to different diverse voices from it. And it's funny. And kids will think it's funny. But these types of issue-centered topics don't go away. And so once I started getting into this and listening, and I made sure there was different types of voices and not just Tim Allen's voice, but other voices. So in what we're going to talk about, the specific one today is a narrative and a counter narrative. So you're listening to 2 different families that are very similar, but their experience in voting is completely different. And so I married the C3 units with Hollywood or history, which is your inquiry. I married those together. And so every chapter has dimension 1 through 4 in it, and it can be a unit. Teachers can cut it down. And I put dimension 1 and 2 together and 3 and 4 together so that they're all inquiries. Their students are going to learn about these through the television shows, be entertained, but also start academically looking at them and then looking at the primary sources behind those. So a lot of this is politics and laws. And so a government class would be great to use this in, but current events, sociology, different things like that. So you can use this in a variety of courses, but I wanted to make sure that it was done in a way that was respectful for everyone sitting in a class, that it was culturally responsive, and that it had the inquiry where the students were not just learning about, okay, this is what the law says, okay, this is what just happened in the Supreme Court, but also that they got a chance to talk about it, and that dimension 4 allowed for that. And how does it affect you? How would this affect you? And then they come up with solutions to that in their community. So they look at it at a bigger, and then they just bring it into a smaller, and how it affects them. Because I think sometimes when you're teaching, if you're a lecture-based teacher, which C3 is not,
Mhm.
then sometimes they just regurgitate things back to the teacher in the test, and they don't actually experience what those laws do for them, or is it against people, or why did it go to the Supreme Court. There's not a lot of how does this affect me? There's not a lot of that. It's just regurgitation. And so I wanted to make sure that it was done in a way that the kids would enjoy it, the teachers would enjoy it, and it would be in a respectful, and then the inquiry. So I married those together.
Great, yeah, and you bring up a couple of good points about your book and some stuff we've already talked about in prior episodes. So again, first of all, when we did the Hollywood or history strategy, we encouraged our readers, if you will, teachers who were going to use it, to not show the entire film. So if you're showing a Hollywood, picture like, Braveheart, don't show the whole film, show clips. And I think the interesting thing about television shows is, 22 minutes without commercials. So you're right on that line where you could certainly show the entire episode to your students and have them do the analysis using the primary and secondary sources based on that. So we're kind of like right in the middle of almost being the perfect medium where you show the entire thing, they get the content and the context, but you're not taking up your entire class to do it like you would if you try to show an entire movie. So that's interesting. And then again, we mentioned the C3 framework quite a bit in this series, but the C3 framework, for those who may just be listening to this one, is from the National Council for the Social Studies, Civic, Civic, career, college, college, career, and civic life. And again, that is a inquiry-based framework that many states have adopted for their social studies programs to make sure, again, that the teacher is the facilitator and students are going through the inquiry-based process to come up with an understanding about a historical topic or a social studies topic, like you said, civics, economics, whatever. So definitely, if you're not familiar with the C3 framework, which by this point, after 10 years, you should be, and we also have the C3 mentioned in each lesson plan in the series to kind of help guide you through that process. Well, excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit about why, you talked a little bit already, but why television? We talked a little bit about it being almost the perfect medium with 21 minutes or so. But why did you select to do a full volume on television shows as opposed to maybe movies?
It's easier to talk about issue-centered because sitcoms are now. And so they are talking about issues that the students are experiencing now, and it's almost in real time. I understand that they film them, maybe a month ahead than when they come out, but it's real time. Movies are not. And, you have to film them, and then they produce them, and they do all of the things that they do. So sometimes movies don't come out for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. So that was 4 years ago when they filmed it. Things change. And we know in education, our trends change, the way we teach changes, data changes, a lot of things, testing changes, a lot of things changes. But those issues are almost filmed in real time, and they bring out what's going on at the time. So all of these, I mean, my book's been out for a while now, but all of these issues are still issues that are talked about today. And they are big enough that even if you're going to talk about in the next, election period, which is going to come up in 2026, we've got voting in this chapter. Those issues are the same that we talk about today. Not a lot has changed from the last couple of elections. And so because it's more in real time and it's issue centered, it's not historical. Now, they do, throw in some history. They do throw in, the laws that they're talking about. But basically, it's the issues and what's happening in society. And so I felt that it was the same. You can use the same inquiry, but it was different than what was being done in the Hollywood or History series. And I think that allowing this to be taught in different types of classes, you could do the voting one in sociology. And so it expanded it more than just, well, this is just US history, this is just world history, this is just about trauma. This actually you can pretty much put in any class if you have those topics that you're talking about in class. And so I felt like this just expanded Hollywood or history. And like you said, you can show the whole, once you get the permissions from the district and all that stuff, you can show it. I do caution the teachers on Derry Girls that they should show clips, but that's the only one that I caution them on, just because that's an Irish television show.
Okay.
And so their sitcoms are allowed to say things, during airtime that ours are not. So I did caution them on Derry Girls, but other than that, all the other ones you could play straight through.
And listeners, if you've been to Europe, even their commercials, you may want to consider getting permission slips before you show them. So, but great. And you would say that your book, so just for the audience, your book is more geared towards secondary, even more like high school, like 9 to 12. Is that correct?
Yeah. 10th, I would say 10th, 11th, and 12th. 11th and 12th for sure. You can modify them for middle school, but I don't, like for voting, you probably could modify it for middle school. Some of these issues probably are not appropriate for middle school just because it doesn't fit with your content. And so I would say this is pretty much secondary, but you could modify some. And there are lessons in here that you could modify for middle school and not do the whole C3. So if you are in middle school, definitely pick it up if you're interested. And especially if you do a current events class, this would be good as a framework for you.
Great. And so again, so you just like Dr. Mark Piercy, who did a book on war films, which we've discussed in a prior episode, you wrote all the lessons. So you get to be the editor and the lesson writer guest as well. And when we talked off air, you wanted to do your chapter 10 about voting, which you've kind of referred to a few times already. So, but can you talk a little bit more about your chapter 10, where you're going to be looking at, like you said, Last Man Standing and the television show Blackish?
Yes. So I chose chapter 10 today because, we're going to be doing midterms here pretty soon, but also Canada just had a major election also. And you can do a comparative. If you're an AP teacher, you could do comparative again, Canada and the United States. I did this because I wanted one chapter to be a narrative and a counter narrative. I don't put those words in my chapter, but that's what it is. The students will watch Last Man Standing. It's a 2012 election. So it's President Obama and Governor Romney. And they will analyze what's being said. They will analyze what his daughters are experiencing with voting, what kinds of conversations they're having. It's intergenerational. So there's 3 generations in the household. And the mother, I think she's funny, but the mother refuses to tell anybody who she's voting for. And so the whole episode, she's going, who am I going to vote for? Who am I going to vote for? So you have representation of different types of, I would say on a spectrum, you have a representation of extreme conservatism, middle of the ground, and then liberal. And so, and they talk about that, and you can see how each one of the daughters feels. It's very, obvious, and who they're going to vote for. One of them doesn't want to vote, and so they go through that. The next one is Blackish, and it's the 2020 election. And although they are far apart and they're not the same presidential candidates, the same topics are being talked about in an episode in 2020 and 2012. So those issues are still the same. They're talking about how they get to vote, where it's not available in voting, and they're talking about the same types of things. It is interesting because in the Blackish, it's a male child that is having issues with voting. And in Last Man Standing, he has daughters, so it's a female. So they have two 18-year-olds discussing their first time voting. And then their attitudes are completely different about it. And then how they talk to the grandparents, and that it's also intergenerational in that. On paper, if we wrote down on paper, these two families are almost exactly the same. But the way that voting is talked about, the way that voting is described, the experiences of voting with the different families are completely different. And so you're looking at a narrative with Last Man Standing and then the counter narrative with Blackish. They bring a lot of different types of history and laws into both of the episodes. And it's less about the presidential candidates. I mean, they make jokes about them in Last Man Standing. They don't even talk about the presidential candidates in Blackish, but it's about voting and what issues we have in voting in the United States. And so you're getting to compare and contrast with that. And also, I think that I didn't say in your last question, there's an element of I get that. So, and in my family in particular, I'm from Oklahoma, so we are a very red state. I lived in Missouri for many, many years. That is now a red state. When I moved there, it was purple. And then I lived in Massachusetts, which is a extremely blue state. And so I've experienced these during voting times. I've experienced all of these different types of attitudes and different types of uh, experiences that people have told me about in their own types, and in their own voting experiences in these different states. And so watching these episodes, it's like, I get that. I understand that. I've experienced that, or my friend has experienced that. And so I think that you get a little more empathy when you're watching sitcoms because they're short and that issue is the whole issue, the entire 22 minutes. And so you go, oh, I can get that. So when someone has an emotional reaction to anything, the likelihood of them remembering it because they've connected it to an experience is higher. So I think that that's something that when you use television shows, students understand because that's what we're doing right now. Versus if you're, watching 1776, they may not get some of the things because it's not as relevant as what's going on today. And so I felt like voting was we had to have this in the book. And then I was just lucky enough to come across these two episodes previously before I wrote this. I didn't write these chapters in order. I wrote Derry Girls first because I had already started that prior to even knowing anything about Hollywood or history. But I wrote the voting one quickly afterwards. So it was probably the second or third chapter that I actually wrote because I felt like so strongly about it that this narrative and counter narrative needed to be shown in the classroom so that they could analyze that and they could look the laws up. And they do a great job of getting it right, honestly. I can say that on the podcast. But the kids will figure that out. And when they look at the sources and everything. And I was very cognizant that it needed to be neutral. When they're learning about the websites and the different things I found, they are neutral. It tells them what it is. It doesn't tell them how to think about it. And
Yeah.
so they're getting the information so that they can actually use the primary sources and some historiography thrown in there a little bit, so that they can they can answer the questions. I do use the Hollywood or history question.
Mhm.
That's mandatory in all of them. However, I do use compelling questions. So my compelling question for this, so they write more than one essay. My compelling question for this one is, does it matter if you vote?
Right. And you bring up,
And so
yeah, you bring up a great point about voting and that first time. I mean, just to talk a little bit about my voting history, I got held back in kindergarten. I couldn't color in the lines. So everybody listening, you can earn a PhD even though you got held back in elementary school. And so I could vote when I was in high school. I remember, I was a senior in high school and I was, I loved history, loved social studies, and I'm like, heck, I'm going to go vote. And I went to the booth and I remember who I voted for. And I remember coming back to school and wearing my I voted sticker. My teacher was like, oh my God, why is this old dude in my class? But even though I looked like I was 12, but I mean, it's, and I didn't know what to do. I walked in there. You didn't learn about this really in your social studies classes, even civics, right? You talked about the three branches of government, blah, blah, blah. But what does it mean to actually make that decision when you are going to vote and and use your right to vote, and it's a super important decision that you don't really understand or have to think about that first time. You mentioned the Canadian election. My stepdaughters are Canadian, and they both decided to vote for the first time because of the issues at hand in this current Canadian election. And again, having a conversation with them about the platform of the two major parties in Canada, even though it's a five-party system, but you have two major parties, a decent-sized third party called the NDP, and they really wanted to talk through the planks of these parties' platforms, decide what they thought was going to be best for Canadians. So again, it's just something that we don't really learn a lot about, even in civics classes, that I think your chapter really helps students analyze and maybe understand. Again, like you said, especially if you're working with juniors and seniors, for those who can vote or are about to be able to vote, I think this is a super important topic. So I'm glad you elected, no pun intended, to discuss that chapter today. So let's talk a little bit more about your selection. So you kind of mentioned it briefly between why you chose Blackish and Last Man Standing, but we also really try to encourage anyone who's doing a Hollywood history lesson to use those state standards. We are in an age where there's a lot of pushback on history and social studies in all states and federally. So at this point, it's even more important for our teacher viewers and listeners to go back to make sure they are teaching the standards that their state has set up. So can you talk a little bit more about the state and national standards that you selected that went along with the episodes that you selected as well?
I was very cautious about not just putting the states that surround me, because I think that we think like that. We're central. I'm in Missouri, so I'm going to do the states around me, or I'm in Oklahoma, I'm going to do the states around me. I didn't do that. I think I got 48 of the 50 state standards in my and I mean, and I tried to do it regionally. I tried to do, basically, from the Pacific Coast, and I tried to do that in each chapter, not just like shove them all together in one area. So I was very cognizant about this. So I looked at all 50 state standards. And I tried to get those in there. They're very interesting. If anybody does analysis for state standards, bless your heart, because they are so different. Sometimes it was actually I couldn't use a state standard because there was nothing that actually fit with what we were doing, and I'd have to switch states from chapters so that I could find them. What I tried to do, I didn't think, oh, okay, this state does NCSS. I'm going to make sure that I didn't do that. I did not repeat a state. I tried to make sure that, all states were represented. Obviously you like Nevada is in this one. And so I looked at their standards and I got as close as possible to it. Some standards are intricate, like Massachusetts. Some states, like Arkansas, are pretty much the most general things I've ever seen in my life. At the time, they might have changed, but at the time that I was writing it. So, I think that when teachers go to their standards and they say, "Oh gosh, like this is issued centered." Sometimes you could get in trouble, and I do caution, make sure you do the lessons. And I say that in my book, do the lessons first, modify to fit what you need to do. Like, because I don't want anybody to, get in trouble or whatever. But
On the front page of the Missouri Times, basically.
yeah, exactly. Like that's the last thing I need is
Right.
one of my teachers,
Yeah.
this professor I know said to do this.
Right.
That's the last thing I need. So, everything can be modified, obviously, but I think it's just important that you follow your standards. I know a lot of teachers since I supervised, I've been in thousands of classes over 15 years that I've been doing this at the collegiate level. And some of them don't even look at the standards because their principals don't make them. So why would they? But I always say, let's look at them because, that's the first thing that you're going to have to explain if someone makes a phone call. So I do teach that obviously in my methods courses, but using those standards also can give you an idea of what you need to add to the lessons that I've written. Now, I did an ungodly amount of research before I wrote any of them, which you will not see. It looks like it took me 5 minutes to write this. That is not the case. It took me over a year. So I did a lot of research. I read a lot to back up each one to make sure that I was doing the best that I could to match standards in all 50 states, but also to do the C3 correctly, and then to give the students agency in every single one of these chapters so that they can talk about these issues and how they affect them. Because once you get someone who gets interested, they start doing research on their own, and you've taught them how to use those primary sources within each of these chapters. And with all of Hollywood or history, every book that's been published, it's the same. Once the kids get interested in that, you've taught them how to research correctly, how to look at bias in different perspectives, what's a narrative and a counter narrative. You've taught them that so they can go do that on their own. And I think that's the main goal, especially in voting, is to look at these things, read them, but know how to read them, how to critically analyze, critically, use your critical literacy to do that. And so I did a lot of research. So one of my friends was making fun of me. They're like, "You can write this in 3 minutes." I'm like, "Yeah, that's not how it went." But the amount of research I did, because each issue is different than the other. It's not just one little thing in American history that, I had to research all of these and make sure everything I did was accurate and make sure it's balanced. And so, I think I can say this. I think it's a good book. I actually got it out. I haven't looked at it in a long time. I got it out. I rewatched the episodes last night to make sure, because it's been a while. And so, and I thought, oh gosh, yeah, this is good. And for me to say that about myself, I don't do that. But if you don't see something for a long time and then you look at it and you're like, oh gosh, yeah, we need to do this in classes. And so I was proud of myself for just doing it, but then I thought, actually, this might be something that's really good.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, this is one of the, that, and of course, my favorites, Derry Girls, but I thought this would be the best chapter to talk about on the podcast. But obviously I have gender, sexism. I talk about, again, Derry Girls, talk about the troubles. And so I actually tried to talk about things that maybe weren't. The troubles is usually not taught in the United States. If it is, it's like very minuscule, because rarely do teachers get past World War II, and I'm right. Unless they have a special class that's after World War II because they run out of time. Same with me when I was a teacher; it was the same with me. And so they really get to that, or they even talk about it. And so a lot of people in the United States don't know what the trouble is. A lot of kids don't know what it is. And so I tried to look at those and say, what is sectarianism and how does that affect the United States? And so we talk about Bill Clinton in there also, kind of got off subject there. But
Yeah.
so I tried to get a lot of different issues in there. I got prejudice, and then I made sure that the television shows were culture responsive. I made sure that they're funny. Obviously, they generalize. One person will generalize the population, a certain population, because that's what sitcoms do. But that it has different viewpoints in the sitcoms so that you can discuss that in class.
Yeah, and you bring up a lot of good points about how these lessons were made. So your book, you doing it by yourself. All the other edited books where you have different authors. I mean, it took us, and I've written several lessons in these books as well. It takes us a long time. I mean, we're doing the research, we're looking at the state standards, we're trying to do everything we can for you, the viewer, listener, teacher, to be able to take these lessons and use it as have a strong start. We don't want you to do it like a scripted, do this, do this, do this. Even though we write it that way, we want you to add and to these lessons and adapt them to meet the needs of your students. But we certainly have put a lot of time and effort in every single one of these lessons, a lot longer than maybe that 30 minutes you're thinking. But we also want you to be able to take these ideas. That's why we go step by step by step and eventually make your own lessons. And I really like what you said, Star. Not only the teacher makes a lesson, the C3 framework really wants kids to develop their own compelling questions, supporting questions, inquiry, that kind of thing. So even, when you get, especially with older kids, if you've done a few of these lessons throughout the year, maybe they could come up with their own Hollywood history inquiry-based lesson where they go through the process to see how accurate these clips are. So I think we really are trying to help any teacher take this idea and either use what we've already written, take what we've written and adapt it, or hopefully create your own. And then again, maybe for some of your older students, or even, your elementary school students who may have had it for a few years, they can kind of do something similar. So that's great. Let's talk a little bit more about our interesting question, step number 2. You kind of briefly mentioned that obviously when we wrote the series, we have the compelling question, Hollywood or history, Hollywood being 100% inaccurate. Nothing about this clip is accurate. It's all fake. It's all Hollywood. It's all made up. Or history, everything about this film clip or whatever is accurate. It's almost like you went back in time. Now, with your book, because you're not looking necessarily at history, more of a socialized topic, but we can't change the title every time for every book. You have to have this compelling question and also some supporting questions as well. So could you talk a little bit more about the development of your compelling versus supporting when it comes to your volume of the series?
So Kathy Swan has a book. Well, I think she has several through NCSS, and one of them is how they write the IDM, which is the C3, but it's kind of her way to do it. And so I was doing this prior to, but if there's a teacher that needs to know how to write compelling questions, I happily tell you to go on Kathy Swan. I think it's Design the IDM or something like that. And she goes through the types of questions because there's different types. I use one certain type where it's off the wall. I want them to be able to think. I want it to not make sense to them. I want it to be something that they have to use evidence to back up, but they also sometimes have to decide what the question actually means. And then they back it up with their evidence. So it's not a supporting question on, when did Pearl Harbor happen and what happened. It's not content related. And so that's how I teach it in my classes. And most of my students want to choke me, but I'm like, just think about what you want your students to think about. You don't want them, if they're able to answer the question, that's a supporting question. Compelling questions make you think. So I teach the social studies class. The first day of class, they do the first part of to teach them how to do C3. I teach them like they're in high school because they are 18 years old because they just got out of school. And so I actually teach them the very first part of my Derry Girls because I know that they don't know a lot about the Troubles. And my first question to them is, do zombies repeat history? And so they go, "What?" And then we listen to Cranberries. And so everything relates to that question that they're going to use. And obviously, we don't go through the whole C3 because I only have a little amount of time to teach them. But I teach them about the C3, and that's the hook. So I'm very committed to my hooks, and I'm very committed to that these questions are off the wall. And then we use the Hollywood or history question, um, so that they can use that and use the evidence from that graphic organizer. So they're thinking kind of crazy stuff, but then you bring it back to the Hollywood or history, and they have to tell you, yeah, that law that they talked about in Blackish is actually true. Yeah, the Supreme Court did take out Section 5. So they're looking at those things and they're saying, yeah, that's true and that's true. Well, that was true, but they talked about it like this, and that might lean this way or that might lean that way. And so they're analyzing those things. And then at the very end, you ask them, okay, does it matter if you vote? So they've actually gone through both of these episodes. They've looked at these laws that they're talking about. They have to know who Romney is. They look at the definitions that we, and the vocabulary list that we give them, and they go through these things, and they have to say, yes, it matters if you vote, and then they have to back up their, with the evidence that we've done in class with the primary sources, or no, it doesn't, and then they tell me why. So they get to reference the television shows because they're referencing the laws or the conversations they are having, but they have to explain that with fact. And so using these types of compelling questions that I choose to do, there's 4 different kinds. You don't have to be crazy like I am, but my former students that use these, in their classes, they love it. I got a text yesterday from Taylor, who is she's presented with us, and she's also an author in 2 of your Hollywood or history books. And she was like, okay, I don't like this compelling question. Let's change it. So she's been teacher 6 years, and we still collaborate, and we still look at different things and think about what's the craziest thing that we can ask here. So it makes them think. And if they can answer the question, in my opinion, they're not going to be interested. That's not a hook to me. And so I always say, ask them crazy questions. Does it matter if you vote? Well, they'll have an initial reaction to that, but they usually can't back it up. Or it's an opinion from a family member or opinion from X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But they can't back it up with fact. And so I tend to do different types of questions that are off the wall. The kids, in my experience, I've seen this done in middle school. I've seen this done in 7th grade, 11th grade. I've seen it done, and it works. And there was an actual reaction to 7th graders when they had to answer the question, does China make the world flat?
Mhm.
Because it's about globalization, but they don't know what that is yet, because that's the first thing they're asked. It was a visceral reaction. This is the stupidest question I have ever heard in my life. I was in the back dying laughing because I made the question up, and I was teaching the teacher, who was a former student, and then the student teacher. I was teaching them how to do this because it's when C3 just came out. And I mean, visceral reaction. But at the end of the C3, they're saying yes because they realize it's a metaphor. And then they use the metaphor, and then they back their answers up. So
Yeah.
it's a staunch no at the end, but by the end, they get all the economic information. They've learned some of the economics, what sweatshops are. And at the end, they're like, yeah, maybe. And then they tell you why.
Right.
And so, I think that is an evolution of thought. So you can see how the students are evolving in their thought processes. And sometimes things aren't literal when you ask a question.
Right.
And being able to back that up with a balanced, and that's the hardest thing to do. I'm just going to tell all teachers that is the hardest thing to do, is to find balanced sources that answer a crazy question.
Yeah.
And so, I think that we all do that really well in your books. And I did. I mean, I was very I mean, I would sit at home for hours and hours going, is this balance? Like, I was very important to me not to be one way or the other. And so, my sources and stuff, I feel like I did a really good job with that. But also, you can add to it because, and you can subtract from it or whatever you feel like. So, I think developing those questions are very important and thinking about those and not throwing up a supporting question, which is a lot of teachers I see do. They usually call them essential questions, compelling questions, same thing. But I think using a crazy one, which I do throughout my book and throughout any publication I've done, I think that just gets them thinking about it. And it's a true hook. It's hooking them
Yeah,
in.
definitely. And it's like you're a natural podcaster because you've been on one before. This you talked a little bit about your sources and what you selected and the care it took you to decide to find, like as you said, balanced sources. So step 3 in the process is selecting those sources. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific sources that you selected for chapter 10 concerning the episode of Last Man Standing and Blackish?
Yeah, I took what they were talking about and then I researched it. So, and I researched it in a way that it's not what I thought at the time that was going on because, like, it's issued centered. So this stuff was going on at the time that I was writing these things, and so I was very careful to make sure that it was factual and very careful to make sure that the students could say they say this, but it's actually this, or they have this is factual, but the way they presented it was this. And so the 1965, they have a very good section in Blackish about the Civil Rights Act of 1965. It's excellent. Whoever wrote that is very clever. And they show the progress of that going through that and why it was, and they talk about that on screen in that part of the episode. And so that's a very big part of it. And then the Supreme Court case where they remove Section 5, that was a big part of what we're going to talk about when the students look at the primary sources also. And so I took cues from the episodes, and that's how I chose the primary sources so that they could use the episodes, quotes from the episodes. They can use that in the Hollywood or history graphic organizer, but also in my compelling questions. So although it's not a primary source because it is fiction, what they're talking about is true.
Mhm.
And so they can talk about that and say, well, they referenced this in this episode. They referenced it in this one. It's different because, and then they tell us the factual part. And so I took cues from all of the episodes. I rarely went outside of it because I felt like that would be way too much for the students and the teacher. And so I took cues from everything. And like I said, most of these episodes, I was just watching for entertainment. And then as you do, as every social studies teacher on the planet does, you go, I can use that in class. And so, and then I go back and look at it through an academic lens rather than just watching it, on a Saturday or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And we all do that with museums, TV shows, movies, songs, everything. Like you said, Cranberry Zombie. I mean, I'm sure it's a great idea, but you're probably not the first one to use that song. But maybe you are. Maybe.
No, I doubt that. It's a good song.
Yeah, it's a great song, especially people our age. So you talked a little bit about the organizer. So step 4 in the process is to develop a graphic organizer. Every lesson in the book series has a organizers that I developed when I first came up with the strategy. Three boxes where kids are able to use that to keep track of their analysis. So one about the primary source, one about the secondary source, and then one about the movie. I tell my students to use the questions of historian: who, what, when, where, why, and how, as they go through this process. I also let them know that not every source is going to answer all these questions. That's why we use multiple sources. And then you have a box at the bottom that says Hollywood history, how accurate is the film. So every author in the book series has to use that particular organizer, but then a lot of authors have also either adapted it or added another type of organizer. Did you have to do that with chapter 10, or did you use the standard Hollywood history organizer?
I use the standard Hollywood or history organizer as the basic one. However, I did have graphic organizers to fit different sections of the lesson plan, and the Hollywood or history one fits with that also. So I used an organizer from the National Archives that is specific to media. And so they use that when they are analyzing the TV show. And then they use the graphic organizer, Hollywood or history, and they're used together. So it's not separate. They're using all these organizers together. So because I have 2 or 3 different compelling questions in each one, your organizer fits with the question that we ask: is it Hollywood? Is it history? And then my compelling questions fit with, and those organizers, they are aligned to fit with the question that I ask. So it works beautifully together. And then within the lesson plan, I tell the teachers, you're going to use this organizer, you're going to use this organizer, you're going to use this one. And then I give, like we have the organizers in the books, but also then I give the website so that they can use the particular one that I was talking about inside. So I did use both, but they all work together.
Great. Yeah, and again, we have that standard just as a starting point, but we certainly encourage our teachers to add to it, change it, bring in new organizers that you may know about. Lots of great organizers out there. So anything like that definitely works. So as a teacher, after you find your state standard, after you decide what media that you want to use, after you write your compelling and supporting questions, and you find your sources, then you actually get to show the episodes to your students. You've talked a little bit about the content of both of these episodes, and unfortunately, due to copyright, we can't show them, but we can certainly describe.
No.
But is there anything you want to add about these 2 episodes that you would be showing your students with your lesson plan?
I mean, I think once the teacher watches them, when they're doing their prep, I think when they watch them, and they're looking at the lesson plans that I created and everything, I think they'll go, okay. It's your brain, as a teacher, your social studies teacher, your brain starts doing this. So I think the teachers are going to be able to add questions. I think that they're going to, be able to align anything that they want to adapt to what I've done. The episodes are excellent, I will tell you. And although they're 2 different elections, they're the same. I mean, the issues are always the same. And sometimes you'll have to listen to pick them out. But, the sibling conversations are similar. The parent conversations are similar. The intergenerational conversations are similar. And so I think that this is something that teachers would like to do, but also, anytime you look at any of our Hollywood or history lessons, that adjustments can be made to fit the needs of your students or the needs of your policies. And I think we're very cognizant as authors in all of them that we're cognizant of, because it's happened to us where we have this wonderful lesson that we got from this wonderful PD, and then our policies, it goes against our policies. And so how do you adapt that to fit within the policy? And I think that we do a really good job as a group that you can adapt those. And so using these television shows, I think, again, like Derry Girls, I always go back to that. But I tell you, if I feel like you might want to make sure you cut this out. In Derry Girls, I give specific times that you can show that has no cuss words, that has no innuendos, that has none of that. And so you don't have to show those episodes. Also, if you feel uncomfortable with one section, you can cut it out. And so I think, looking through this, and all of us have done a really good job of being able to adapt what we've done, but also what we use can be used in the classroom. I think that we're all very cognizant and have had issues or have come up against friends that have had issues. And so I think we're all cognizant of, we may or may not be able to do this in Montana. If I lived in Montana, could I be able to do this? Or if I live in Massachusetts, yeah, they probably can show all of Derry Girls in Massachusetts if they get permission. I mean, who knows? And so it just depends on the culture of the community, depends on the culture of and the principal and the policies. So I think that we do a really good job of adapting them, but I think that you can 100% use all of them and trust that we've picked what we pick, but always watch them first. I just caution that. Always watch them first.
Yep, always watch them first. And as we've said in several other episodes, it never hurts to run this by your administrator. Say, hey, this is based on the state standards. This is what we're going to do here. This is what we're going to show, and get that extra layer of permission. I mean, I'm all about academic freedom as a university professor, but I was also a school teacher for 8 years. And I was a social studies program specialist for 2.5 years. And I know the politics behind teaching. So we certainly want to talk about these difficult subjects in social studies and history. But again, it never hurts, especially for maybe a newer teacher. Older teachers have to think the same thing. But, once you're kind of established up here in Michigan, we have, basically their version of tenure for school teachers. Don't have that in the American South. But you definitely want to make sure, or the West in some areas, but you definitely want to make sure that you have that extra layer of permission. Again, we're not trying to do anything super controversial, even though we have controversial topics, but that's the nature of our discipline. But you definitely want to add the extra layer. So that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit more about the step 6, which is, after your students watch those clips or that clip, then we encourage them to dive into the secondary sources. I always recommend that one of the best secondary sources that you have as a teacher is the textbook. Textbook will have brief discussions about this topic, and they are state approved. But there are also many, many other secondary sources you could use in this type of activity. Can you talk a little bit more about the secondary sources that you selected that you felt went well with these 2 episodes?
I think because most of these have to do this, especially with this, is government. I linked a textbook for the teachers just in case they've decided to do this in another class, and so I do have a textbook. If this is a government or a civics class, you'll have your own textbook. You can use either one. But the textbook is going to be the main one here. And I feel very strongly about that because the state usually approves a textbook list. You usually don't, as a district, get to go out and pick whatever you want, or as a teacher to pick whatever you want. And I know some textbooks are banned in some states, and some states they're not, because of what they feel is appropriate or inappropriate in history courses. So I did link one for the teachers, but I think the textbook is the best secondary source because you're told to use that. And so if someone comes in and says, oh, blah, 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 you're like, well, I used it. Y'all told me this is what, I'm supposed to use in my class. So I basically use textbooks in this. Basically, the whole book, I've linked a lot of textbooks for the students, or linked like APA. When we talk about gender, we talk about psychology. What is gender? And so I link APA so that it's a legitimate website, a legitimate definition. So I think textbooks and then associations like APA, those are the types of things that the teachers want to use as secondary sources. And I feel strongly that that's the ones that you need to use first, and then look at the ones that we've listed for you and make sure that that fits in also. But again, none of us are going to do anything to get how we feel. We're very cautious about that when we put these together. And so any of the secondary sources will probably be just fine, but most of them are textbooks or associations, or some author that I know that is legitimate and it has a publication, and I've linked that. So those are the secondary sources that I've used in this book.
Great. And for those keeping count at home, that's the first y'all that was dropped. I think the over under is about 3. So we have 2 more to meet that requirement between the 2 of us. All right. Well, great. I appreciate that explanation about the secondary source. And again, like you said, there are other sources out there, but the textbook is your safest bet. If you go outside the .edu, the .org, the .gov, maybe kind of look into any type of permissions that you need for those type of sources. Moving on, so then obviously after they analyze the clips, after they analyze the secondary source, then they get to that primary source analysis, which is definitely probably one of the more difficult steps in the process, especially if you're using older documents, or in your case, very legal documents. So you can talk a little bit more about the primary sources you selected for these 2 episodes.
So the one of the main ones is the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And so the students are going to look at the history behind what that is. They have to know what that is. Um, they don't have to know it in a large quantity, but they have to have the gist because 1965 to a 15-year-old it's the Middle Ages. And so, we need to talk about culturally what's going on. We need to talk about who the president was. Um, you know, we need to briefly talk about what's going on in the world in 1965. Are there any hostilities, socially, and those kinds of things? So, just to give them a brief background so that they have some context, because that's very important. You just can't say, 1965. I mean, I wasn't born in 1965. So, like, I wasn't around then. So, their teachers are probably going to be born a lot later than I was. So, these are kind of things that's very important is to give the students context of what's going on. Then we're going to look at the document. And so, what I've done is I have found educational, legitimate websites that explain what the document is, but is not giving them an explanation that is leaning one way or the other. It's wrong or it's right kind of, website. It's not, they're all educational websites. It's student friendly reading. We're not going to give them the entire document. It's just what this means and what this is. And it correlates with what they're talking about in the episode. And so the tones of the episodes are quite different, even though it's the same topic. And even though everything that's going on is very similar, the tone of the episodes are very, very different. And so when they talk about it, what the tones are, it might be different in one episode and the other because of who the family is. And so they're going to be looking at these, they've seen the episode, so they're going to be looking at these primary sources and kind of thinking about, okay, well, they had a reaction to this. Why do you think they had the reaction to this? Even though it's fictionalized, probably can be based on truth, because that's what fiction is usually it's based on some truth. And so can we find any truth in what they're saying in the episodes? And so basically the documents are student friendly, they're reader friendly, they're not written in a lot of legalese. You will read them directly, the sections that it says, but then you have some explanation for the students on what maybe some terminology means, because legalese is not fun to read for anybody. And so it goes through and it explains that to them and what it is. And so I've made sure that that is, on level for high school students, and that the teachers it's easy to find for the teachers to read and everything like that. So I think that, breaking that down for the students is very important. I think that also reading the exact words is very important. And I know that sometimes they annotate it for kids and stuff, but actually looking at it, the section that we're talking about is very important. And then we talk about the Supreme Court case. There's a website called, it's OYEZ, I think. It's in my book. Anyway, it's the actual court cases, the actual justices are speaking. And so they'll listen to the justices asking the lawyers the questions in the Supreme Court in real time that it was going on. And on the screen, the justice will light up because they have pictures of all the justices. It will light up when they're speaking so they know what justice is speaking and what questions they're asking them. And they are hard on those lawyers and they tell them off. And to me, it's entertaining. But they will actually see a judicial process in the Supreme Court going through. So you have to explain to them in the Supreme Court, it's not like Law and Order. This is not what's going on. Okay. That's fiction. In the Supreme Court, they have an hour and that is it. And they've read all of the court cases prior to coming up here and they have, lots of questions for them. Why are you here? Why is this against the Constitution? And they ask them a lot of questions. They also tell them off a little bit, which I like that part. I think that's funny because the lawyers go, yes, yes, justice, yes. And so they get to actually listen to why they're going against it or why they're for it, and the legal reasons why and against. So they're listening to that, and it's just not a teacher telling them. They're actually listening to the justices that are speaking about this and the lawyers that were defending, or on whatever side they were on. And they talk, and it's short bursts of that the students can listen to. So I think that's important too, because I know when I was younger, the Supreme Court was kind of like, woo, to me, because I
Mhm.
mean, I would never experience the Supreme Court, but we have all these court cases. You can even hear them. It's like you're in the room with them, and you can experience what those lawyers were experiencing, and that they created a law, or they took away part of the law, or they just said, this is not going to work out anymore. And you have access to all of those court cases on this website, and you can use those. So all the websites that I try to use can be used at a later date for different things. So I tried to, in my book, everything that I tried to use could also be used throughout the year. And so it's just another resource that you can use in a different topic, or whatever you're discussing in class that fits your standards. So I tried to do that also.
Yep. And you bring up another good point that we've said in prior episodes, that, famous history educator, Sam Weinberg out of Stanford, said that if you're using primary sources, you can certainly adapt the language to meet the reading needs of your students, but you have to have that actual source with it, right? You just can't like annotate it and then that's it. You need that actual source. So we encourage our teachers who use these lessons to find that primary source, make any needed annotations for the needs of your students, but do keep that actual document with it on the back or in another page or something like that, so your students can look at both the actual document and the annotation, or changes if needed. So definitely want to keep that in mind when you use primary sources, especially for, like we said, older documents, legalese, that kind of thing. So step 8, finally, we've looked at the primary source, we looked at the secondary source, we looked at the episodes, and what we want our students to do at this stage is come up with the answer to the question, Hollywood or history. Now, if you're using an actual historic film, like, I don't know, The Patriot, this Hollywood or history question is just a bit easier. Is this scene 100% accurate? History, 100% Hollywood, nothing about it is accurate, or as we find with all of these lessons, somewhere in between. Now, I definitely want your opinion in a few minutes about those episodes, how accurate you think that they are concerning voting. But for this step, are there any additional ideas or things you want to bring up when it came to your lesson plan about this decision? Obviously, you not looking at history, you looking at government, it does probably need some adaptations, but can you talk a little bit more about that final question in your lesson plan?
So I thought about this a lot because I am doing issued centered curriculum. And we're doing C3. And so we have a extra compelling question or two in there. But actually, it was easy because the way that you're talking about this primary source is the exact same in all the other Hollywood or histories. Are they presenting it accurately, or are they not, and why? And so it worked out perfectly. I didn't have to change the phrasing. I didn't have to change anything, because we're still looking at context of history, and we're still looking at documents of history. And so the students are able to still answer that question, and still, is this Hollywood? Are they trying to make a point? What are they trying to make? Using this accurate document, even though they might have talked about it and it was accurate throughout, the episode. What are they trying to make with that, with this point? What point are you getting? That why would they put this in a sitcom? And so I didn't have to change anything because it worked out perfectly. And then going through the lessons and using that throughout the lesson, the students are familiar with it. You don't just shove it in at the end in my chapters. So you're using that throughout the lesson, and the students are using that to write their essay. So it worked out perfectly. I didn't have to change anything. I just, like I said before, I just added some analysis to when they're using the media, and then they use that with their Hollywood or history graphic organizer. So it worked out perfectly.
Yep, great. And again, you definitely see that through all of your lessons in your book. Again, even though some are more historical focused, some are more other social studies, but definitely you have that concept still there. So finally, with the dimension 4 of the C3 framework and our framework, Hollywood history, we have step 9, conclusion. We want our students to take action. We want them to do something with the information they learned after going through this inquiry-based process. Now, the general suggestion that we have in a lot of our lessons is do it inside the walls of the classroom, do a line of contention, do a four corners activity, have them answer the question and essay. But you can also take it outside the walls of the classroom. They could write a politician about what they learned. They could develop a web
Mhm.
page or a YouTube video or something like that based on what they learned. And again, when you look at every lesson in the book series, you see just a multitude of ideas, different ideas about how to conclude this type of lesson. Can you talk a little bit more about your conclusion for chapter 10?
So I do Dimension 4 a little differently than what an idea may look like. Um, so I want the students to come up with everything. This is very student centered. So you take the compelling question like, do zombies repeat history? And they've answered that. You've after your Dimension 3, they've done all of that. And so now you ask them, okay, we've learned all of this. Is there anything that is similar in our community? And a community can be classroom, community can be community, or school district, or state, or whatever you decide that is. But in our community, do you see anything that's similar to the issues that were talked about? And depending on where you teach, they could say yes or they could say no. Well, have you seen anything in our state? And I start with the lower and you ask, the levels, you go up. Well, if they're paying attention, there's always voting issues that are talked about, and snippets of voting issues at the state level or the local level. And they've moved even in Missouri, they moved some places and the participants, the voters didn't know where they were. And there were some issues in the last election in Missouri. So those are the kinds of things that one kid, there's always that one kid that knows everything about current events, and they will say, yes, the other day I heard this, this, and this. And then you say, okay, so that's the issue. How can we fix it? And it's all student centered. And in my book, my chapter 2 is all about how you do this. It's a step by step. It tells you what dimensions, what they mean, and I'm very adamant about shut your mouth. You're the teacher, don't give them hints. We love to give hints, no hinting. And it's really hard for teachers to do this because most teachers are like, I want to help the kids. No, we don't. They have to have critical thinking is not telling them to write their politician about this issue we just learned about. That's an assignment. Critical thinking is you come up with a solution to a real world issue. That's authentic assessment. And so my Dimension 4s are all authentic assessment. And it's very simple. If they go, how do I find that? You go, I don't know. How do you? And it frustrates the kids, but it gives them they don't know they're getting their own agency, but eventually they'll start creating groups and they'll be like, okay, you look this up. Okay, you do this, as long as they have the tools. The first time I ever did a Dimension 4 like this was with seventh graders, first semester seventh graders. And the things they came up with blew my mind. The way that they were going to talk about the issue that they came up with that and it's always connected to that essential question, that compelling question. And after I did that, that was just a pilot. I wanted to see if it worked because C3 had just come out. And I was like, I'm sold. And so every single chapter tells you to ask these questions, then ask them questions, and don't tell them anything. In real life, you have to figure stuff out. And sometimes it's easier now to look online, but sometimes there's no answers, and you have to figure out who to connect to and what to do and what you need to read. What do you need to read about? What do you need to look at to understand about, the Constitution in Missouri or the Constitution in Georgia? What do you need to learn about the city council? And then one of the parts of C3 that I love is that you implement this with the kids, and that's where the walls come in. I tell my students, you're 22 years old. My goal is for you to keep the job, not lose the job. And so we stay inside the walls. Talk to your principal. What can we do? What's on the line that we can go to? Most of the principals have allowed hanging of posters. They've allowed Twitter. But the kids come up with it. The teachers don't. And so you're like, well, how do we get this to our community members? How are you going to do that? Well, if our community is the school, that's where the posters, kids are, oh, we can hang posters up by the library because everybody walks by the library. So they're coming up with these things, and the teacher has no idea. And by the way, if you teach the same class 7 times, you're going to have 7 different so get ready because they all come up with different ideas. Now, I did this for 4 or 5 years with Why Vote, which is an NCSS publication, a teaching publication. And my students came up every year, it was different. Their implementation was different, but the lesson was the same. And so, my students would go out to the union and they would have students look up to see if they were registered. They would teach them how to register. I mean, all these different things they found out. And then they would have their implementation would be different. So my students have actually done this to learn how to do the C3 as a student, and then they turn around and become the teacher and implement these things. So I would encourage all the teachers for Dimension 4 not to look at a list and give them an assignment, to make them think about it and make them have a solution and actually do authentic assessment. And then know your boundaries. What I have the students do is list everything, and there's 0 boundaries and everything is equal. And the 7th graders wanted to fly to China. I mean, adamant, we're going to China. And we wrote, go to China on the board. Like and then after that's exhausted, their ideas are exhausted, don't squish them. Then reality gets to set in. And I go, okay, your mom is probably not going to let you go to China with Dr. Nance. And do you have a passport? What's a passport? And so when we have reality and we cannot leave the country, we just mark it out. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to do this now because your mom's not going to let you go to China with Dr. Nance. And so we mark it out. And then they'll have this extravagant, and you go, okay, we have no money. Oh, well, we can't do that because we don't have any money. And then we just whittle those ideas down to where it hits inside the 4 walls. And then the kids adjust it as they need it, because we don't hit them with reality until after the critical thinking is over. Then we give them the boundaries of the principal and the policies and everything. And then they take the 1 or 2, they decide, and they go with it, and then they implement it. And it's been successful. All different kinds of teachers have done this. The teachers that are watching this, if my student teachers do this, the teachers that are watching this are just like, I cannot believe this worked. They would tell you it's not going to work. I'm like, well, it will, but okay. I don't argue with them, and then my student teacher does it, and they're like, this is awesome. And so, I feel like sometimes my student teachers are professional development people. And when I'm in the room, we can all talk about it and do that stuff. So I encourage, even if you're a social studies methods professor, to do Dimension 4 with your student teacher, be in the room, and do that with them so that they can see the kids and how the kids react to it. Because the 7th graders, they're not mine, they were Jordan's, but Jordan's 7th graders, I mean, they were all about implementation. And they came up with their own Twitter account, and the teacher had to write the Twitter account, and then they linked it, and then they shared it with all their friends. So it got out to the community about sweatshops and everything was their idea. The teacher just typed it in. And then the principal was very pleased with the outcome and the critical thinking and things like that. And that lesson has been taught for almost 10 years in classrooms. So that whole C3. So, it works. It's just, at first you might feel uncomfortable, but once you start watching the kids think and get it together, and if they go, we need to tell city council. There's one little girl, 9th grader, was like, we need to tell city council this. And all I said was, how do you do that? And then she looked it up. Yeah. So you just ask questions, how do you do that? And then they figure it out on their own.
Yeah. Great. And so, yes, that's, great ideas for how to conclude these lessons using that taking action, or like I said, for step 9 conclusions with these lesson plans. For the audience, as we've discussed in the prior podcast, you will have access to a PowerPoint based on Dr. Nance's book that will provide references and materials list for chapter 10, which we discussed in this episode. We have web links for you as well, links about voting processes, textbooks, that kind of thing. So Dr. Nance did a really nice job of providing all sorts of different sources that you will have access to through the PowerPoint that you'll find in the show notes. So real quick, before we get to anything you wanted to promote, you already kind of mentioned it earlier on. So what do you think? You show 2 episodes of television about voting. Based on our own continuum, Hollywood history, how accurate were those 2 episodes in depicting real life when it came to voting decisions for new voters?
I think it was more history than Hollywood. I think it leaned towards more history. I think the producers, the directors, and then whoever the writers, I think they did a good job on both shows of showing what voting is, how to vote, and then if they are talking about history of the law, they made sure that it is correct. And so I would use more history than Hollywood.
Perfect. And again, we want our students to make that decision, but with Star being the expert, for our listeners that may not, we have 2 or 3 of those folks who just like film and television shows. They probably want to know as your expert opinion. So I do appreciate that. But again, for the teachers, make sure your kids come up with that conclusion. So let's talk a little more about anything to promote. I like to have all of my guests talk about things that are upcoming. I do want to say that you were on a podcast based out of Northern Ireland about the Derry Girls. It was a fantastic episode. I really liked the end of it when they were trying to figure out where your prior institution was, Central Missouri. They go, let's go visit. I'm like, I don't know. You want to go see that? It's like them coming to Mount Pleasant, Michigan. No offense to Mount Pleasant, Michigan. It's a great town, has a casino, but do people from Ireland really want to come visit when you go to, I don't know, anywhere, New York maybe. But anyway, that was a cute conversation they had at the end. But you did an amazing job talking about the book. And you were the first I believe, from the author from the book series to appear on the podcast. So do you remember how they can find that episode before we talk more about what's coming up next?
Yeah, they are ladies that are about 10 years older than me. So they're, 37. But they lived through the Troubles. And literally, like one of them was in a building that blew up from the IRA. She barely got out. And then the other one was a reporter, and she would talk to IRA members, and they had masks on. And it's called The Talking Derry Girls. I would highly recommend watching the Derry Girl episodes and then listening to their podcast. They are crazy and they are hilarious, and they've been friends for years and years. There's 1 Protestant and 2 Catholics. And they give the Protestant a hard time about her toaster. You'll have to listen to understand that. But I found it right after, and then I just was like, hey, I'm writing this chapter in this book. And I became friends with one of the ladies. We still email back and forth. They're like, come to Ireland. And so I've been invited over to I could spend the night with one of their parents in Derry. I said, that's okay, we'll skip that, but okay. But they're super nice. They're super funny, but I'm towards the end. I can't remember what season, but I highly recommend that you listen to them. They're funny regardless. And they do an excellent job of bringing different people on. And in Derry, everybody knows everybody who knows everybody. And that's a quote from the show, but it's true. And they get, Lisa McGee, the writer, she comes on and they talk over her. And, but she knows, one of their mother knows her mother. So she called her and said, you had to be on this podcast. And they were actually in the last episode. They got to go and they were actually in the last episode as extras. So they're very interesting. But what I would like to promote, not just that, you don't have to listen to that if you don't want to, but what Scott and I were editors, and I'm an author also in a new book that's being published by the National Council for the Social Studies. And we took a broader view of film. But this time we made teachers do all of the work, didn't we? And they actually wrote the lessons, we were their mentors, basically. They taught the lessons and then they wrote the chapters. And then some just wrote lessons for us at the end. And so all the lesson plans are in there. They're all C3. We expanded, it's not just television, but it might be television and a documentary. And we expanded those. And then they tell you what went wrong, what went right. They tell you how they felt about it. And basically, they're just having a conversation with you throughout their chapter. And they break that lesson plan, that C3 down for you. And we were interested in, I know Scott had a student, I had a student that wrote one. He actually hasn't graduated yet. He's graduating this weekend. And so, student teachers did it. We had a professor that was in one, and her husband was a elementary teacher. The first part is elementary. The second part is secondary, because we didn't want to leave anyone out, because I'm secondary and Scott does elementary. So that works out perfectly. And I think it's different than what you would see in some of the books that maybe be published and tell you, oh, do this and do this and do this. But they never tell you what screwed up, and they never tell you, but this does. And this tells you, okay, don't do it this way, do this way. The topics are super interesting. Every one of them is not something that is normal, I would say. I co-taught. We have some AI in there. In two of the lessons, we have AI and how you use AI in the classrooms. And I feel like this was something when I roped Scott into this, let's be honest. I emailed him and said, hey, and he had no idea what he was about to get himself into. And so we have the book signing coming up in November in DC, and we presented, and we'll present again. And Taylor and I presented on it. But I think people will be interested in what the topics are. They're not the normal topics. And we tried to put every single different type of everything in there at the level they are. And we also used, which is something I haven't seen myself, is that we made sure that every chapter fit the major areas of social studies. So world history, U.S. history, Civics. And then we have online. We have an online teacher that did one, Taylor. So for sociology. So we have everything in there that you look at. We really wanted this book to be something that is a framework for you to start implementing this into your class. It's not Hollywood or history, but Hollywood or history is referenced. And different other authors that have come before us, they're referenced in how they do things. So I think that it's just a broader way, and it's just like a cousin of Hollywood or history, I guess.
Yeah,
but it's teachers telling what they did wrong and what went wrong and what the kids didn't like. So I do like that part about it.
Yeah, definitely. And we certainly had classroom teachers write lesson plans for the Hollywood or History series, but also a lot of, folks like us, university educators, teacher educators, professors, that kind of thing, supervisors, that kind of stuff. But we do have some teacher input. But for this book, we really wanted this to be a book for teachers by teachers, with you and I just being the facilitators, and really making sure that these teachers did this in their classroom and discussed, like you said, Star, what went right and what didn't go so well, and how would they adapt. And I think this makes this book unique, because a lot of books, even like Hollywood History series or any type of textbook or teacher manual type thing, it is a lot of just like really good ideas. Obviously, we've used Hollywood History in our own classrooms. We have people using it all over the world and have seen it work out well. But this book for NCSS was just, again, okay, let's let teachers really go through the process of making their lessons, doing their lessons in the classroom, and then reflecting on what they saw. So you, audience, if you were to pick up this book, you could, see what someone has done before you if you use that lesson plan, and see what they would do to adapt it, and then have that extra layer of expertise when you try it in your own classroom. And again, we did make sure we had all social studies subjects covered, and elementary, middle school, and high school all have at least one lesson. So this book is for any K-12, no pre-K unfortunately, but for any K-12 teacher. I couldn't find a pre-K person, but for any teacher that wants to bring film, not just Hollywood or history, but just using film in the C3 framework into their classes. I'm very proud of the book. I'm excited. It should be out. So again, these will be dropped throughout the summer. So it should be out definitely by November. So hopefully all the podcasts are out by then. And if you are a teacher educator, come see us at NCSS in November, I guess November, December in DC this year, 2025. And we'd be happy to talk more about the book, and we'll even sign it for you. I still haven't decided what I'm going to put. I think keep fighting the good fight for social studies or something. I don't know. But it's always, that's the toughest thing about this gig is when we write a book, someone wants you to sign it. Do you just sign your name, or do you put something cool and catchy and inspiring? And I haven't mastered that yet. So maybe we'll have a few months to plan Star before our presentation.
Well, I'll let you decide what we're going to write.
Exactly. Well, we'll see what happens. But it's been great having you on the show. Again,
thank you for having me.
I will also say that, you have contributed other lessons for different books in the series. And I'm hoping that you will consider submitting lessons for the upcoming books that will be out. Again, I certainly have plans for at least 3 more where I will be my co-editor, Charles Elfer, and I will be the co-editors. There's also other books in the series. So again, you're so good at writing these Hollywood history books. I hope you will. Well, Star, it's been great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Best of luck with everything.
Thank you.
And yeah, and thanks again for being on. Audience, thanks for listening to Star and I. If you do have any questions for myself or Star about her book, we do have an email address. So any questions for Star and myself, please send your questions to hollywoodorhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Once again, any questions, please send to hollywoodorhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hollywood History volumes are now published by Emerald Publishing out of the UK. All volumes can be purchased on Emerald's website or anywhere books are sold. If the innovative ideas discussed in the podcast have led you or a family member to consider earning an undergraduate or graduate degree in education from Central Michigan University, we encourage you to review the links in the show notes or contact host Dr. Scott Roberts at rober4s@cmich.edu. We offer undergraduate degrees in general and special education at the elementary level, secondary disciplines including social studies, and graduate degrees in curriculum and instruction, instructional technology, literacy, health and PE, and special education. We also have accelerated teacher certification programs for those with undergraduate degrees in something other than education who want to become excellent teachers in the state of Michigan.